Alrighty, welcome back everybody here at the Australian Bitcoin Conference of 2014. Gene Blackley with you here, your guide, and for this panel discussion we've brought together some of the key speakers from this morning's session. So we have Leon Gerard Vandenberg, obviously a specialist in cryptocurrencies and other emerging technologies. We have Dr. Reece Boland, who is an expert in the regulatory and legal considerations that are relevant, obviously, to Bitcoin in different domains. We have Jeffrey Tucker, libertarian and CEO of Liberty Me, who, of course, is a strong advocate for the opportunities that the libertarian opportunities of a currency that's free from government regulation and control. And Jamie McIntyre, founder and CEO of the 21st Century Group, and a big believer in the potential with Bitcoin, backing it with his own capital, starting up a number of organisations in Australia and beyond in the Bitcoin marketplace. So we've taken some questions from the floor this morning and this afternoon, so thank you to those of you who took some time to submit some questions, and for those of you online as well. And where I thought we'd start is a comment that is actually referenced here today with this New York Times article that we actually handed out to everybody with a commentary, which makes the point that so far Bitcoins have resembled more of a commodity rather than a currency. And a question or a comment from the floor was that traditional currencies have value because we trust the issuers of those currencies. We trust the central banks, we trust the governments that control those central banks, and they provide a certain degree of trust that maybe has been whittled away in recent years and is continuing to decline. But what are the implications where we move from trust that's based on governments and the collective that represents, which is apparently everyone in the nation, versus trust, which is a group of individuals have decided to trust each other with this Bitcoin currency? Maybe Jeffrey, start with.
Sure. I would say that I don't believe that's true, that the reason the dollar has value is because we trust the issuer. In fact, it's just the opposite. The reason the dollar has value, you have to look way back in history. We had a gold standard at some point. People believed that you could take the dollar to the bank and exchange it for something real, something truly valuable. The paper by itself had no value. But gradually, over the course of 100 years, governments destroyed the gold standard. Finally, in the early 1970s, Nixon removed the last element of gold, left us just with paper. And since that time, our trust in the currency has just plummeted. Right now in the United States, there are protests all over the country from all political groups against the monetary system and against the payment system. So people are protesting in front of the Federal Reserve. They're demanding answers. They don't trust the system. The payment networks are themselves not trusted at all. What Bitcoin provides is a trustworthy alternative to systems that are rapidly losing the confidence of the public. And 2008 was a big watershed for the dollar. People no longer believed in the system. I mean, we had the President of the United States warning that unless we're willing to cough up $400 billion for TARP, that you could go to your ATM and not be able to get cash out of it. And that's how much confidence has been lost in the system. And that's a big reason why Bitcoin is as popular as it is.
So I guess an element of that is that the trust that is implied in fiat currencies is implied in it because of the gold standard that stood behind it. And perhaps is just trust is built, it's the old equation, that trust is built over time.
It is.
But lost in a second or an instant.
Yeah.
So where does that put Bitcoin as 5 years of trust being built up versus 500 years maybe of government
Bitcoin
currencies?
is rather new, but history is on fast forward now. We live in a digital age. Information is lightning quick. We know everything that's happening in the world very quickly. So 5 years is the equivalent of a pre-digital age of 50 years. Everything's moving very, very quickly. Yeah. And I think Bitcoin has already built up a certain level of trust among a minority, tiny, slim facet of the population, and it's going to expand outwards over time.
Yeah.
The beautiful thing about Bitcoin, too, there's no mysteries with it. You can look at the code. You can watch the blockchain. You can look at everything that's happening. It's totally transparent financial system. There's no secret insiders ruling the system. It's entirely visible and open. And in that sense, it's a far more trustworthy system. It's the kind of system we really need. And it's the kind of system that people want governments to provide. But governments will never provide that. They never will.
Yeah.
Because they have too much to hide, actually.
Yeah. Jamie?
Yeah, I think, there's two things that's caused Bitcoin to even be created. One is in 2008, the credit crisis, where there was a major distrust of the central banks, the Federal Reserve, etc., the irresponsibility of just relentless printing of money, and also the internet. When I first wrote over a decade ago a chapter in my first book about fractional reserve banking, the debt-based system, central banks, and how they have taken and manipulated the power of that. It was considered a conspiracy theory 10 years ago, but now it's mainstream.
Yeah.
Now most people go to the internet and realise, hang on, fractional reserve bank and the Federal Reserve, why does the private elite bankers have control of the issuance of money? So that started the distrust. And then credit crisis just proved what many of us said would happen by the end of the decade. There would be a crash. So those things have said, hang on a minute, we no longer trust to the level we used to, so this is where Bitcoin emerged. Bitcoin would have never been created if they weren't irresponsible with our current, you could say, dishonest and non-transparent monetary system. So why will people trust Bitcoin? One, it's transparent. It belongs to the people. And I believe the average person in the street, once they understand that, are they going to support the banks that they detest? Are they going to support governments which they don't really... in Australia, you're forced to vote for one party or the other. In America, it's the same. Most Western countries, they prefer, if there was a third choice, not to vote for either of them. So the reality is many people are open to something new. It will take time, like anything develops credibility. But despite all the challenges Bitcoin's faced, it's still strong. It has a floor under it, and it's only getting bigger. So I don't think trust is such the issue, because the trust is more the problem that the current financial system has, is the lack of trust. That's the problem they have, and Bitcoin has a less of a problem with that.
And as you said this morning, there will be another banking crisis.
Yeah.
It's coming.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing there is that we're moving from the trust behind a form of exchange being held with a handful of entities. There's the Reserve Bank, the government that controls it, and then in Australia, the four pillars of four big banks in our banking system. Whereas now what we're talking about is, we're talking about trust, that trust is collective. It's a collective trust, that it's not about 6, 7 major organisations, be them commercial or government, but rather it's the collective trust of, well, I'm trusting millions of other people whose interest is to trust me as well. We all have to trust each other, or it's completely defunct. Is there some power in that?
We have Bitcoin, we've got frequent flyer points, could be a form of currency. Mobile airtime credit's a form of currency. If you've travelled much in Africa or Southeast Asia, you come across M-Pesa and things like that. So people will trust in things that work and that are reliable in their own experience. Trust has come and gone for different technologies over time, depending on how they've been treated, whether consumers were treated properly, whether they had the experience as a positive or a negative one. Regulators can help sometimes on that. You'd expect me to say that, but anyway. So trust does come and go based on people's experience. A lot of people don't really think through about why it is that they trust in US dollars or Qantas frequent flyer points or airtime credits. But if their experience is good, trust will grow. If their experience is not, trust will decline.
Yeah. So I guess what comes to mind with that is that, trusting my Qantas frequent flyer points, maybe I'm one of you gentlemen flying from one conference to the next every month, and I've got 500,000 frequent flyer points. They may be worth $20,000. But if Bitcoin's going to go to another level, then we're not talking tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. We're talking about people wanting to store millions of dollars of value. Is it just a matter of time? Is it just a matter of getting used to the idea?
I think the markets have to develop. The technology is in its infancy in some way. We need a few years to get it going. I would say it took email 20 years to go from being an edgy technology to something everybody used.
Right, and then the youngsters today think it's
old-fashioned and absurd.
Don't
right,
yeah.
It's a formal way of communicating with people. You never want to do it. Right. So I don't think Bitcoin's going to take that long though, because as I say, history is moving faster now. So I'm very curious about this, because a year ago, there were very few users of Bitcoin, very few ways to use it. 1 year ago, that's how matured the market has been in the course of 12 months. Where are we going to be in 12 months from now? Yeah. 10 years. It's going to be unbelievable.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Leon, Gerard, I'm interested in what you would add to this about what you observed yourself, but also what the Navy observed around this trust issue with Navy cash. I mean, it was backed by Chase and the US Treasury.
It was backed by US Treasury, and your salary was going into the pool, so you were trusted to use it because you were ordered to. If you didn't use it the right way, you're in the brink. You know, the only way you could feed yourself in the canteen was to use the system. So it was not an elegantly sort of bootstrap sort of process, you were told, and it happened. So it was kind of like some of these coins that are mined into existence, but there's pre-mining, and that's really what happened, you know, as one metaphor. Back to the whole trust thing, they trusted that it would work. So they found all sorts of ways not to make it work, but it still works. So the system was stress tested, people would break their cards, and they found that they were easily replaced, things like that. On the mechanism of trust and versus Bitcoin and Fed Reserve, I'd much rather trust math and cryptography than trust something like Ansett. You know, I was left stranded in Queensland. It was a nice location, but I enjoyed a very nice, noisy ride back home when I was living in Adelaide via some aircraft, Air Force jump jet, I think it was. So we had the earplugs and we were in the back hull. You know, that's how we got back home. So the Australian government provided the final trust mechanism to get myself back to my home domain. So I was stranded by Ansett. I lost all those frequent flyer points.
Me too.
Unless, you know, I still have them somewhere, but if I lose my Bitcoins, sure, they're gone in the ether, but if I keep them and I have the good stewardship, I trust that they're going to be available because the protocol has been inspected, the fragility of the system has been, you know, tested as well, and that derivative, what would come next after Bitcoin, will also learn from those stress tests. So I really think the new mechanism of trust is going to be a distributed trust rather than a fiefdom or a power to a few sort of stakeholders. It will be sort of this mechanism where a community or distributed intelligence happens.
Yeah. So what can accelerate that? You know, what we're saying is that rather than top-down trust, which is maybe what we've had in the past from government structures, that this notion of a collective trust, that we're all in it together, what can accelerate that? What can accelerate the adoption?
Great
of Bitcoin
enterprises
from
can make the difference here, is what I think. I mean, you know, it's very interesting. I was recently in Austin, Texas at a Bitcoin Expo, and there were something like 1,000 exhibitors there. And most of those businesses did not even exist 12 months ago. Incredible. There's an enormous amount of competition, and with competition and entrepreneurship, you get the best that rise to the top. And I think it's what it's going to take. I mean, ever better businesses with ever more innovative strategies, ever more dedicated to serving the consumer. And we've had a lot of nightmare stories in the Bitcoin world, people losing a lot of money because the infrastructure is too weak, because there hadn't been enough players out there competing with each other. And people are learning, as you said, from the past. You know, there's stress tests going on right now.
A few people made the comment today about trusting the math and, you know, I guess first trusting the government and value judgment there. Everyone's got their own answer to that one. I get nervous whenever somebody tells me that the technology is infallible or the maths are infallible. I was a financial services regulator when somebody told me securitization was safe. So I've seen a number of these things come and go. I mean, they breed us slightly sceptical as regulators. So nothing's infallible, no technology is infallible, no piece of software or cryptography. So I think trust will build if people have a good experience, but I'm cautious anytime somebody tells me it's infallible.
Yeah, so there are limits to that. I mean, you know, one of the questions from our audience members here today was, well, what about quantum computing? You know, what are the implications for cryptography, where it stands today, for cryptocurrencies, when we look at sort of the quantum
Leon's probably the right
computing
one to answer
potential?
that, but
Yeah.
I mean, the quick answer to that is that the Bitcoin protocol can be adapted to new eventualities. It's an open source protocol. The developer community knows what's going on. If quantum computing breaks that cryptography, there'll be a possibility of adaptation. That's very different from national monies, you know, which cannot adapt. Clearly, we've learned they cannot adapt in the face of new realities. Bitcoin's an open source protocol. It can always change, always. Yeah.
think
Leon?
that's well answered.
Well
That's fine?
answered, yeah.
I said what I needed to say? Okay. Sorry.
So from a different perspective, a question again from our audience today, thank you. From a macroeconomic perspective, what are the implications of having a fixed or actually relatively decreasing money supply? You know, if Bitcoin is capped at 21 million coins, then what are the apparent maybe inflationary, deflationary risks that attach to that from a macroeconomic perspective? And I feel like I'm going to start with our fellow of economic education here.
Okay.
on that
Yeah,
one as well.
actually, this is a very, very interesting question. I'm glad you asked it. Our culture has been very much shaped by the expectation of inflation. This is one of the reasons we tend not to save money. Nowadays, it's very difficult to save any money because you don't get paid for it. You'd rather get rid of your money and get stuff instead because your money is going to be worth less in the future than it is today. Under cryptocurrency, we have every expectation of the opposite. Our currency is going to grow in value relative to goods and services over time. That changes our internal value system. I don't know how many of you have actually owned Bitcoin, but what happens to you when you own it and you realize, oh my goodness, this thing could be in 2 years 10 times more valuable than it is today. You start looking around your house and you think, look at all this unbelievable junk I've accumulated over the last 10 years. I wish I could put all of this in Bitcoin. It changes your outlook towards the material world. A deflationary economy. I don't like the term deflation because it sounds negative. Actually, what we're talking about is a currency that grows in value over time relative to what it can purchase. It will change our outlook on life itself. It's going to cause us to become savers rather than spenders, to become less materialistic, less consumer-oriented, and start thinking about the long term. That's a gigantic change in the culture, in the economic system. And I think it's very much welcome. People worry that, well, we can't function economically in a deflationary environment. This is nonsense. I mean, if you just look at the computer and software industry and the price of memory, the price of computing power over the last 20 years, it's been in a radical state of deflation, and it's also been one of the boomingest industries in the world. So if you expand that model to the whole macroeconomic environment, then we've got a prescription for wonderful economic growth and innovation. However, let me add something. Bitcoin is necessarily a deflationary currency in the sense that it's capped, as you say. We'll reach that cap at 2140 unless some miracle of technology occurs, we'll all be dead. But not all cryptocurrencies are this way. Other protocols are made to be constantly inflationary. And I'm really intrigued by that because I wonder whether or not there's a certain market demand for a constant rate of increase in cryptocurrency over a long period of time, unto infinity. We're soon going to find out because somebody like Litecoin and Dogecoin and all the protocols based on those are infinitely inflationary. People like them because people like to mine coins. That's really interesting to me. I wouldn't have expected that. Regular people can't get into Bitcoin mining. It's too expensive. It's too hard. But anybody can mine Dogecoin, and that's a major source of its popularity. Yeah. People really dig it. You know, you can use your Samsung cell phone to mine Dogecoin and tip people on the internet. So there might be a certain market for that, you know? Right. It's very, I like this because this is the beautiful thing about cryptocurrency. It destroys the pretensions of intellectuals like me, actually. You know, we're submitting everything to a market test now.
And also, you know, it undermines the established power base of the large capitalist model. You know, the notion that here we are, Bitcoin has reached a point already where you basically have to have corporate resources to mine Bitcoin. But when we look at Litecoin and Dogecoin, and there's a host of other cryptocurrencies we haven't necessarily touched on today.
It's very interesting. Why do people like to mine? I think it's a very interesting question. It has something to do with an ancient desire to sort of generate money out of a laboratory. You know, it's sort of like alchemy or something.
Yeah,
like that, you know?
It's alchemy.
You turn on the computer and you can make money. You know, there's something that taps into our most sort of perverse desires. You know, it's something like that.
Making something out of nothing. Almost, you know?
It's not that perverse, though. I think it's a good
Yeah, well, I guess it's an element that there's a bit of effort required, but you're building on other people's earlier effort.
No, it's interesting. Yeah.
So what of this notion then, and Leon, Gerard, maybe I'll start with you, of Bitcoin evolving, and there's lots of ways to discuss how Bitcoin might evolve. But the notion, and one of our guests today, I think it was Hass McCook, said, well, what potential is there?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The next speaker will be at the Imbas main stage, Jack Schwager, acclaimed author of Market Wizards.
Well, there's millions of market wizards now mining cryptocurrencies. But the question, I think, came from Hass McCook in our audience. From Nicholas, who said, in time, what qualities could Bitcoin adopt from alternative cryptocurrencies?
Okay, I'll have attempt at that. So I think the Bitcoin protocol might be tweaked to look at other sorts of conditions for what you might call supersizing the blockchain to put another protocol on top of that for logic and or smart contracts. So some of these other coins, like Ethereum, is going to have that sort of blockchain capability by design, but Bitcoin's going to need to have that bolted on. So Bitcoin has all the grid computing power and all the corporate resources applied to it right now. Ethereum is still going to have its genesis day, and it will be stress tested, but I don't think it's going to displace Bitcoin. People will try and come up with Ethereum-like things on Bitcoin because of the traction that it has and the fact that it has all that security with all the nodes that are doing the auditing or mining or however you want to describe that. I also think the value-added services on top of that will come into the evolution and the use of Bitcoin. Once the threshold of 21 million is hit, people are going to have to be creative about the value proposition on how they do Bitcoin auditing or providing that gateway and transaction services. So it's going to be a different sort of economy, much like there was 20 TCP/IP stacks in the early version of the internet, and now there's maybe one or two and some very good open source runs, and specialist ones do specialist things. But there's still the same TCP/IP protocol. It's all vetted by people, and that shared protocol is a known specification. So Bitcoin will evolve into that sort of mature protocol.
Back to this issue then around trust and maturity and how it might grow and evolve, and the broader community coming to understand open source and the notion of, well, who's got control of this and who can change it? And it's like, well, no one has control of it. It's a collective control. Excuse me. And back to my question earlier about what can accelerate it. So some people say, well, is it a matter of someone like Google or another big player, some carrier making it happen in a mobile space as a form of payment?
Look, it's a good question, and look at other technologies that have grown and become more popular and better accepted. You know, clearly Apple wasn't the first to have a mobile music player, but they made the most convenient and attractive and popular one, and they've got a huge market share, and you can go through a whole lot of technologies, and the first person who came up with X is not necessarily the one who has the dominant position now. So I come back to what I said, which Bitcoin is a very clever concept and a very clever technology. It will succeed or fail based on how people experience it. If it's not the virtual currency that succeeds, somebody else will, because the concept is useful. But the one that succeeds will be the one that has a good experience for the customer, treats them properly, has a way of dealing with problems if and when they happen, and they will happen. And that kind of thing. So I think that's realistically how trust builds. Obviously marketing helps. Obviously, big companies that are good at marketing may get into this and speed it up. But trust builds and trust fades in this sector like it does in any other sector.
Yeah, I think you see companies like Amazon that haven't adopted Bitcoin yet because people suggest that Amazon wants to release its own digital currency. So you have large corporations like that have scale that could really do something with that, but I think they've missed the boat because Bitcoin now is such mainstream and so well known. Like Apple could easily create, or Facebook, digital currency, but would we still want to trust, even if we like Apple, it's a corporation once again that would control it, or even Facebook. So I think Bitcoin still will have advantages over those because it is open source, it is, it's not controlled by, a corporation or a government. And I think that's its biggest benefit. So that's where I think, these other companies that are resisting accepting it, they're going to be forced at some point to accept it, I think, because they're going to miss out on too much revenue if they don't.
I think it's very well stated, actually. I mean, a proprietary company at this point cannot compete with the open source protocol of Bitcoin. It's not possible. I mean, I'm sure you've heard these rumors that Apple wants to create, iCoin or whatever, and this is one of the reasons that the iOS is now disabling Bitcoin wallets on its phone, which is pathetic, an outrageous decision on the part of Apple. I mean, that seems very obvious to me that they are making a terrible, terrible mistake here in doing this. I mean, this is a very fallible company. We've seen a lot of mistakes take place over the last, I would say, 18 months, and this is probably the worst one. I mean, when people are making YouTube videos that consist of taking a .22 pistol and shooting their phones and posting them, this is not good for a company, actually. Yeah. Yeah,
It's not good for the phone either.
Not good for the phone, says Jamie. Yeah. That's right. So that's back to that issue of the trust just disappearing. So Bitcoin's got this first to market advantage, for want of a better term, while referring to something that's open source. We've sort of suggested it's 90% of the market value of cryptocurrencies today. Well, I'm interested in where you gentlemen see that it could go. Is it a matter of that, if we look back through centuries and millennia, that there's always a dominant force in something, that the American dominant empirical role for the last 150 years has served the world well, not just in a number of ways, including providing the greenback essentially as the reserve currency of the world. And now suggesting, these things change, but in the end you always end up with a dominant force.
Yeah.
Can Bitcoin remain a dominant force?
Theory would indicate that all of history is tending towards a single currency for the world. That's the theory. However, reality is different. And I fully expect that now that the protocol is unleashed on the world, that we're going to see a proliferation of niche coins that are going to be actually quite persistent and very much in demand. In the United States, the Indian nation of Lakota has just implemented its own currency. It's called the Maza coin. It's based on the Litecoin protocol. They wanted their own currency. I totally get that, right? Dogecoin is popular because it's a great tipping currency, and people like the way this dog picture looks. I mean, that sounds crazy, but it's not actually.
I know that some people in the audience want me to ask you, are you a fan of Sexcoin?
Of Sexcoin?
Yeah, there's one called Sexcoin that's sort of for trading adult services.
This
and
I don't
goods.
know.
We have a largely adult audience.
I mean,
here.
it's very interesting. I have many friends who are kind of what I call them Bitcoin snobs, and we argue together all the time. And they have some sense that Bitcoin is the only legitimate cryptocurrency. I don't believe this. I think that we're going to see as many coins proliferating in the world as we have toothpaste or wines or anything else. And I don't see a problem with this. Yeah, Bitcoin for now is dominant and will probably remain so, maybe for the foreseeable future. But if the core developers of Bitcoin get too conservative and fail to adopt the newest technologies and fail to adjust the protocol in light of some new innovation we haven't anticipated yet, Bitcoin will go away and it'll be replaced by something else. Now, maybe to people hearing this sounds like chaos. Can you really have a world monetary system that's constantly in flux like this? I mean, my answer is yes. The world is constantly in flux. I mean, that's the way the world's built, and we need a currency that reflects that unrelenting desire for change and improvement. I see no problem.
I've got a thought. So the one theory of payment systems is it's a network economics, or it's a two-sided economy. So it took a while for each of the credit card schemes to get established, and some would say there's a natural limit to the number of payment schemes there can be, because it's only attractive to hold that card if there's enough merchants that accept it. It's only attractive to be a merchant accepting that card if there's enough customers carried in their wallet. Now, I know that's a physical analogy rather than a virtual one, but some people would say because currency is attractive if there's a number of people using it. There's a network effect.
Yeah.
That actually might limit the number of currencies that can actually be a success.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The network effect. I mean, Bitcoin is now not everyone, but October last year become pretty mainstream. So it would be very hard for another currency to get. I mean, it's the Coca-Cola, so to speak, or the gold and the silver. So, but that can happen over time. I mean, it would take a lot now. I think the others will ride off the coattails of Bitcoin. But if Bitcoin did fail to some degree and people still believed in digital currencies, then yes, another one could emerge. But I would be betting that Bitcoin will remain dominant for a very long time.
Network effect is real, but it's not determinative, in other words. I mean, people believe that Windows was going to always be the dominant operating system. In fact, the U.S. Justice Department, and filed this lawsuit that lasted like 10 years to try to break up its monopoly. It wasn't the government that broke up that monopoly, it was market competition. Now Linux and iOS and many other operating systems are eating away at its market. And so the network effect is powerful, but as I say, unless the core developers are really on the... And the other thing is that you don't always know in advance the right way to adjust the protocol to make it most favorable to market conditions. The core developers themselves face uncertainty about this. They don't always know. So we're just going to have to let the market run and let it play. And I love the fact we have competition here. In the World Wide Web, when you develop a website, you're always running like 4 versions. You've got your alpha version, your beta version, your staging version, and your live version, but there's no final release, ever. So we're seeing that same kind of process affect currencies now. We've got alpha currencies, beta currencies, staging currencies, and the live version of Bitcoin. I love that. That's beautiful. We don't even know what this world looks like. We haven't had development and competition in the world of money for like 100 years.
Yeah, there's more disruption coming, but I think it will be scaled, and if it's worth value, it will be introduced into that Bitcoin or Litecoin sphere. And whether or not the innovation comes from compute power or a different type of crypto technology, then that sort of innovation will interrupt some of that flow and progress and growth, and we'll start up another growth curve in a different kind of way. So it might be, Bitcoin mining on your cell phone, or it'll be some sort of derivative of that in Africa because there's 1 billion phones there, and there's not 1 billion phones elsewhere, or except maybe China. So there's definitely some other things that are happening when you look at the cost of an Android chipset, for an Android phone dropping to $12. You might find out that there will be a new player in the phone wars that will maybe have a Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency toolkit as part of its original system. So it won't be Android or Apple with that, it'll be a new player and it'll be for the masses. So that's the sort of thing I see potentially evolving out of some of these China hardware, or maybe even India or Vietnam sort of hardware plays, because the cost of doing this with a bit of silicon, solar-powered sort of battery recharges in these domains, the rate of innovation is really happening. They will fail fast, they'll learn quickly, and they just evolve this sort of game of life in the blockchain,
right,
all that way.
But
So
the beautiful
quite
thing about the way you're describing is that whichever cryptocurrency is dominant in the end, like they will all outcompete national currencies. Humanity is longing for a better system of money and payments. And cryptocurrency is providing that right now. And no matter who or what's dominant in the end, national monetary systems will not be able to keep up. There's just no chance. All the power in the world will not beat a great technology. We've seen that again and again over the last 20 years.
Yeah, it can't be held back. And of course, we live in an age where, thanks to many great technologies, it's accelerated the world like never before. So to look back at the adoption rate for Visa and MasterCard, and then all of the very small market shareholders in credit cards that Australians aren't familiar with but use in other corners of the world, it's no point in looking back for an understanding of what might be, really, because it's a completely different paradigm now. It's a completely different networked world for the network effect to make it happen, yeah? So with the opportunity, I guess you've got a situation where if we look at open source then, what's happened with open source? So if we look at Linux If we look at other open source software, things like WordPress mentioned today as an open source platform for content management or publishing websites, and how they've adopted. What can we learn from those? What can we learn from open source? Because that's what we're talking about. I mean, that to me is a key differentiator of Bitcoin, is that it's open source. It's a network of trust rather than an organisation providing the trust.
Well, let me just say about open source technology. So the great thinker named F.A. Hayek had a theory that if you really want to extract great information and unleash on the world the best possible technologies and the best knowledge about how to do things, you have to have a system in which the players are radically aware of the time and place of their own lives, and they can apply their own talents to making that thing better. And that open source, in that sense, open source is much better than any kind of top-down solution. And it's very interesting to me to see how software has developed over the last 20 years. We used to think software is best developed by private companies by hiring big experts. We now know that's not true. The best way to extract and gain information to have the best possible products is to throw it out there in the world and invite anybody who's interested in it to apply their own knowledge and their own wisdom to improving it. And that's what Bitcoin has done. And in that sense, it's radically implausible. It's a little bit crazy, but it just keeps working again and again and again. We've seen that over the last 20 years. The open source technologies actually perform better than centralized technologies. Whether those technologies come from governments, certainly, but even private companies cannot compete with the amazing skill of an open source community. And I think that's the key to Bitcoin. I always like to, when I talk to audiences about Bitcoin, remind people that, in a sense, no one is an expert on Bitcoin. You know, we all think we know things, but in the end, we don't know everything. No individual can know. We only know as a community. And that's what's beautiful about Bitcoin. It's out there and extracting information from all sources. It humbles you, really, to be in a world like this. But it's a beautiful world because it calls on the community of all interested parties to apply their knowledge to making the world a better place. That's what open source is all about, and that's the key, I think, to Bitcoin's brilliance.
A question more than an answer. How much is that relying on people's goodwill? So at some point, is there a risk that the economic return from mining is not sufficient to incentivize those to keep contributing that effort? Could the system actually fall into disrepair at some point if goodwill wasn't there?
Everyone involved in the Bitcoin space has a strong interest in maximizing its value and its integrity. That's extremely important. So there's a lot of stakeholders in this world of Bitcoin. It's a little bit like living in a subdivision in which every owner, everyone who lives in a subdivision, I don't know if you have those in Australia, but like a private community, right? Okay? So you own your house, and you get together in your little meetings, and people try to decide what's going to happen to the common property. There's a lot of disagreements, but everybody agrees that the main goal is to maximize the value of the property. That's why you get along, regardless of your politics, regardless of your outlook on life, right? It's that way in the Bitcoin world. Everyone in the Bitcoin community wants it to be as good as possible. You asked the question about miners and verification. At least in our lifetimes, the incentives to dig into the protocol and make it as good as possible are not going to disappear. There is the very abstract question for us: what happens in 2140 when the last Bitcoin is mined? And I hope that Satoshi has thoroughly thought through this. I hope that the fees associated with transactions alone will be enough to incentivize people, because presumably the value of Bitcoin will be so high at that point that it'll be enough to incentivize the verifying community and the core developers to develop it.
Okay. My day job at Fair Trading, the community living analogy both encourages me and frightens me slightly. We see some fantastic disputes in strata living, but anyway.
So let's look at something a little bit different then. But what about the maybe the opportunity for conflict where we have something that is a payment system but is also a commodity, it's also an asset? And you sort of touched on it before, Jeffrey, when you said that people who start having significant Bitcoin holdings start looking around their house and going, why have I bothered spending money or cash on these things that just lose value, and the utility of them declines and I no longer use them? Whereas if I just didn't spend less and kept more of my stuff in Bitcoins, my actual wealth's increasing. I mean, what are the implications? There's a few different directions we can go with this.
Yeah. And I'm sure this way, but let me just say very quickly, some economists believe this dooms Bitcoin because you're not going to want to spend it, right? So therefore the velocity will collapse and, it'll be useless. But, this is a little bit silly. By the way, this is Paul Krugman's point, right? He's like a dedicated Keynesian. He thinks that the economy falls apart unless everybody's just like rushing out all the time, buying hot dogs and drinks, and we have to be in a constant frenzy of spending, where the economy is going to collapse. This is wrong. Actually, the basis of prosperity is not spending, it's saving. It's saving that leads to investment, and investment that leads to growth. It's not spending as such. The other thing to remember is that in the end, even if you own Bitcoin, you kind of have to buy stuff, actually. You got to have a plane ticket, you got to have clothes, you got to have food, and that kind of thing. I mean, you might reduce your spending, the velocity might go very low if we get very high Bitcoin prices, but in the end, you have to use the Bitcoin. So, it's not a problem.
I think time out, people, especially in Australia, like spending time on the beach, but some great innovation happens, at those sorts of moments. So I don't think it's a frenzy of purchasing that needs to happen. The one thing I wanted to just test your theory on was about the current limit of Satoshis as the finest grain of element, and I think the blockchain could be tweaked that way,
really,
as being a finer division.
Oh yeah, you mean not just 8, but
to go a couple more digits.
Well, I think
just because in developing economies, a Bitcoin will be so valuable, and in developing countries that will not quite be it, or else we're going to have some sort of sidebar build of Bitcoin, Bitcoin, Lite for something else.
I mean, you make a very interesting point. I mean, it makes you wonder if part of the demand for cryptocurrency, like Dogecoin, is precisely the absence of Bitcoin to meet that market for micropayments.
I think I want one of you to just explain a little bit clearer about what you're really referring to. Because the key thing of reference point is that Dogecoin currently is worth a fraction of a cent. Maybe about 20.
Can I give you an analogy?
0.2% at the moment.
So I was in Zimbabwe in 2007. Inflation was the second highest ever on record, just behind Weimar Germany. It was at a stage where prices weren't printed on things because the currency was too volatile, it was changing. And that starts to hurt commerce. So if you can't actually have prices in the menu in the shop, and if they would only charge us rent in our motel by the day because the price was changing constantly because the underlying currency was moving, and the price of the local newspaper changed in the 2 weeks we were there. And so a really volatile currency is less useful as a payment system if you can't denominate prices in that currency conveniently. So there is, the more volatile the currency is, at some stage it becomes less helpful as a payment system.
I think the argument between a commodity and a currency, a lot of people see it as a negative thing. It's a positive thing. I mean, the US dollar would love to have this challenge. If you go and invest in US dollars, it's going to be worth 10 times that in a year or two. So remember, it is a positive. And they say, well, it's a negative, it's so volatile, but Zimbabwean dollar, in your example, which is a classic case, it's volatile on a downward trend, you know what I'm saying? Bitcoin is volatile upwards. So that is a positive still. It mightn't be perfect for a payment system, but it's a positive because it means it's a potential to go higher and higher. And then this idea which you raise about the debt-based consumer model of the financial system is a debt-based system that's unsustainable. So that's why the US wanted to led up to the credit crisis and the property bubble is they continued to want to allow people to spend and buy their way out of trouble. I mean, the central bank solution still is now just keep printing money, and hopefully that will push the problem into the future and the problem will go away. But we know the problem won't go away. We also know that you need to save 10-20% of your income to have an abundant future, not spend 110-120% of your income. So the fact that the hoarding idea that, well, if Bitcoin's going to go up in value, people won't spend it, they'll just hoard it. No, because humans also know they're going to turn cold one day, stop breathing and die. So therefore there's a counterbalance that we'll hoard some, but we also want to spend some. And the reality is that hoarding argument, there's a lot of people I know in this country that are poor rich people. They've got a lot of assets, but they live like they're impoverished. So hoarding occurs even now with a devaluing currency. So I don't think the hoarding issue is an issue because we're going to want to spend some and save. If we save more, we're all richer as a nation, as a world.
I think we could have a little fun here for a minute. Maybe get a little bit speculative and pretty wild about the future. Everyone enjoying the conversation so far that's here with us? I'm just thinking about, well, to your point of we all turn cold and stop breathing and die one day. But if I think about the fact that, well, actually, there's a theory that medical science is leading to, pretty extreme longevity for humans, and that maybe by 2140, the lifespan of human beings is not really in years, but is in decades, and maybe we're living to 200 years or something. Let's just riff for a little while here of what's the future where we do have a planet with finite physical resources, but Bitcoin and other virtual things aren't necessarily finite. Bitcoin is at 21 million units. But if we look at the notion of maybe this kind of currency that actually is constantly appreciating in value is actually going to change the sort of fundamental capitalist paradigm of spend, consume, and that's actually not really working for our planet if you want to believe what's happening with our environment. That if you bring those things, what's happening for our environment, limited physical resources, potential increase of longevity of humans, anyone might want to have some fun there about what they think that means for the future of planet Earth and the human race? And then we'll get back to some more, tangible stuff.
Just quickly, I think there's two theories in the world at school. We're taught economics is the study of scarce resources, which I don't think is accurate. There's the abundance model, there's the scarcity model. I don't think there's a finite amount of things on the planet. There's an infinite amount of things if we look at it. Let's say, people say, what about oil? The world is going to run out of oil in the 70s. Well, that didn't happen. They said it was peak oil production 2012, but that hasn't happened. There's continued flaws in that thinking of scarcity. Oil was a black sludge in the ground discovered in Texas, I think. It had no value until they realized they can turn it into something. So, so in other words, it's human ideas, human ability to take something and turn it into something more. There's plenty of food on the planet. The world could handle a drastically much larger population. So it's all about sustainability and abundance thinking that will change the world, not a kind of relentless consumerism and debt-based system that's based in fear and scarcity. That's what the problem is in the world.
My own outlook towards the future just dramatically changed when I discovered cryptocurrency, because it made me wildly optimistic that we can rethink fundamentally the way systems work. We've been stuck with these rotten systems of money and payment systems in the case of payment systems, for about 50 years. In the case of money, it's been more than 100 years. They're frozen in time, they're anachronistic, they're dinosaurs. And I always believed that the only way we could change the system was by convincing the politicians to change it, which is very unlikely, actually. So when I saw and discovered this Bitcoin and the protocol, the fact that a revolution can happen from below made me realize it's not just Bitcoin that can change, it's everything that can change. If we have the right innovators and the right minds at work on an open source and distributed network, working entrepreneurially to throw the system into upheaval and come up with new technologies, we have every reason to be wildly optimistic about the future. Even if governments never change, even if we're stuck with the systems that they manage, The point is to reinvent the world, not reinvent governments. They're never going to change. We can reinvent the world on a completely, on a basis of entrepreneurship and distributed networks and open source protocols and blockchain cryptography. I mean, this is the basis of something spectacular. I'm at this point in my life more optimistic about world prosperity than I've ever been, ever. I think we can look forward to a very bright and brilliant future. As for the nation state and its old-time regulatory apparatus, I think it's just going to die. I think it's going to become increasingly irrelevant, especially when you consider blockchain technology combined with 3D printing and open source distribution of CAD files and stuff like that. I mean, there's no patents or regulations anywhere in the world that can survive this technology. This is beautiful. This is brilliant. We need to start being imaginative and think about things that don't yet exist, that are more brilliant than what we know right now. And then I think we see a world of endless opportunity and prosperity.
Yeah, because you bring together some very powerful forces. And so what Jamie, I guess, is highlighting there is that there are those things that are scarce in the world, and then there are those things that are abundant and limitless.
Right. Ideas, as you say.
Particularly ideas, obviously, and creativity. Gentlemen, anything to add on that one? Riff on the future?
I'm quite attracted to the thought that how we pay for stuff changes our behaviour. I think it's true. There's plenty of studies that people spend differently using cash compared to a debit or a credit card, so I think that's quite valid. Things like how much food there is in the world and how much land there is in the world, obviously not directly affected by how we pay for things, but how we treat them will be affected, so I think that's positive. For as long as we have the need for governments, and that may cease at some point, because we need a police force and we need a defence department and things like that, they will probably charge taxes in the local currency. So you will need a way of converting Bitcoin or whatever it is by that time into a locally recognised currency. So I think they will coexist for a while, and they will need to make their peace with each other. And I think that's part of how the future has to play out as well.
Okay, which part of science fiction is going to become science fact? So the science fiction bit is that in Melbourne we're already working in some areas very, very strong. One is cryptocurrencies, and there's a great startup community here of good innovation and bootstrap. I think in life sciences, this is the other area of domain sort of exploration where your DNA will become part of your wellness, your life, and that doesn't really mix up with Bitcoin at all. My other aspect is my learnings is pattern recognition, and I'm actually helping a startup here do pattern recognition on your DNA to look for anomalies that will show cancer or the predisposition for cancer, not the chance of cancer. So the Angelina Jolie moment was not necessary, so that you could actually have a more prescriptive approach to your well-being, and that will turn out to be people living longer, decades and decades. But the plastic surgeons will still have a good job. And probably, we'll be up here with our personas, our surrogates, because I don't know how good we'll be looking that way. It is a really exciting future. This is a brand new science, computing science and financial sciences. So this distributed blockchain thing, this little beastie that is out of the bottle, is definitely going to create some disruption in government, and whether that's a big, strong government that's been a leader in the world, some younger, more nimble governments may find success in the areas of Cyprus and some of their Bitcoin activities, or maybe places like Iceland with Aurora coins. So I have great sort of foundation learning will happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and then some sort of disruption will come along, and there will be some thinker that will just get the parameters right on this next version of the next thing, and it will be that next blockchain thing. I'm not quite sure what it is. I hope to be alive to see it, but it's a great source of innovation and great hope that we can deliver this sort of mechanism to the masses, and we can do it for a relatively cheap bit of kit, and provide that benefit of proper money that is not usurious, that is going to be the benefit.
All right, well, I think it's enjoyable to step out into that realm of it. But for those of you here live at the conference, we obviously have the advantage of we can continue that line of inquiry fueled by alcohol at the cocktail party in about 30 minutes. So coming back to some more tangible things about current issues with around Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. I guess that some commentators make observations that there are different pathways that we could go with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies to take them mainstream. And of course, one of those is almost a blasphemous suggestion in this New York Times commentary article that most of us are reading here, suggesting that actually is the way for Bitcoin to become mainstream is to actually have more government regulation attached to it, and actually maybe that's a source of building trust to it. Is there some middle ground that Bitcoin doesn't become the utopian libertarian ideal that we're kind of focused on so far in our discussion here, but rather is something that's more closer to the way things currently are,
right?
But a step.
I have lots of friends who are involved in this whole world, and it's very interesting for me to watch how they're thinking about this issue of regulation. I mean, on one hand, I don't know any serious Bitcoiners who believe that we have to have government regulation in order to make the system work. They don't really believe that. But what they think is that it's better for the Bitcoin community to get out in front of the inevitable regulations and help craft them and make sure they're not hostile, make sure that they're at least comprehending of the nature of the technology. Right now, regulators are trying to pound square pegs into round holes. That makes no sense. The taxing systems, the money exchange, the business regulations, everything's a little bit wacky. So there's a lot of people in the Bitcoin community say, look, let's meet with the regulators. Let's meet with the people at the Fed and have an open and honest dialogue so at least they won't kill us, so at least there'll be some rationality to the regulations going forward. Other radical libertarians or anarchists that come out of the cyberpunk movement from the 1990s say this is a sellout and an outrage. I tend to be a moderate on all these questions, I guess, a little bit. I understand the desire of people to meet with the regulators. And I must say that I myself am more or less glad that they're doing so. Because it's better to have rational regulation than to have a full-scale war. We don't want that, actually. That would be catastrophic. The other thing is I'm pretty confident about the protocol itself. I think it will resist anything that's utterly absurd. And if a regulation goes too far, I think the protocol is robust enough to survive that and actually be able to work around it. Of that, I'm pretty confident. So I actually don't fear the regulators as much. The biggest cost of the regulators and the regulations is going to be that it's going to cartelize the entrepreneurship space. I mean, I mentioned this earlier in my speech, that after FinCEN went after many of the Bitcoin exchanges, dozens, if not, nearly 100 exchanges that were either currently in operation or were planned just folded shop. I mean, that's what regulations can do. And the only survivors were those that were heavily capitalized enough to do that. That's not a problem for Bitcoin. That's a problem for the infrastructure that surrounds Bitcoin. And governments need to be aware that everything that they do to make the Bitcoin space more costly to get into is actually making it less innovative. And as long as they understand that, I think that we're going to be able to avoid the worst of the regulations. I must say, the Federal Reserve has been friendlier to Bitcoin than I ever would have expected. I mean, you get friendly comments from Bernanke. I have friends who work at the Atlanta Fed. They love to come to my talks. They're very interested in the space. The Department of U.S. Treasury Department has been very willing to meet with the Bitcoin Foundation in the U.S. Part of it, I think the problem is that governments have been so behind over the last 20 years. Like, governments have missed the boat on everything. It's starting to get a little bit embarrassing, actually. Like, governments are still regulating like it's the 1960s, and it's now the 21st century digital age. They're so behind. And I think there's many people, very smart people, in the money payment area of regulation that don't want to be bested by the Bitcoin community. They don't want to just be shown up. So they're showing a degree of friendliness. And I don't expect there's going to be a great deal of hostility in the future. You know, you see things coming from Russia, from China, but I don't think that's going to happen in most parts of the world.
Dr. Boland?
Yeah, have to say something probably. Friendly regulator, I like that. We try to be friendly. It's a bit of wait and see for us, to be honest, and most regulators seem to be in the same boat. I said in the talk earlier, the legislation that we administer predates Bitcoin and therefore doesn't have any particular provisions for or against it, and we're working with that and meeting with people and, to be honest, getting our heads around it as well, which is why we come to conferences and read books and articles and that sort of thing. If and when something goes wrong and people lose a bunch of money, they will ring their local MP and they will ring their local regulator and they will expect something. So they have rights and responsibilities, as I said in the talk, in the Bitcoin world as they do in any other trade or commerce. So eventually there will be a call for some kind of regulatory response. I hope it's proportionate and sensible. That's certainly what we try to do. But, you know, that'll be a good, healthy debate, I'm sure.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, someone in the industry, I'm pro-regulation. I think if it's balanced regulation, I don't think that hurts. I think it adds a lot of credibility. So those who are positive about it, regulation will add credibility, will push it into the mainstream. So there's a lot of benefits of that. I think, like ASIC and a lot of the regulatory departments, they're sort of sitting back because they don't really know how to handle it. And I don't think the hostility is going to come from them. I like when I was in New York in January, they had that Financial State Department Services inquiry, and Lawsky, who was behind that. They're quite pro. There's politicians out there and senators, etc., that are quite pro because they, like us, want to see some healthy competition to the banks. They don't believe that it should be in the hands of the other central bankers and private elite either. So there is a lot of people in government that are quite pro this. I think the greatest risk from regulation, and I guess if you understand how regulation occurs, every industry has its lobbyists that go to Parliament, to push the senators, etc., to lobby to say do this. And this industry is new, so it doesn't have that big a lobbyist yet, but they'll do their best, and that's part of what we have to do as an entrepreneur. You have to fund lobbyists to push your agenda for the industry. I think the greatest threat is from the tax departments, the IRS and the ATO. The ATO has been somewhat aggressive here. They're the ones that could cause the most damage or attempt to. So that's where we've probably got to lobby more to make sure they don't do things that are stupid, that agree. They don't want to miss out on the revenue either, so they've got to balance it as well. But if they go and do stupid things like double GST on Bitcoin, that could happen if they're not sure what they're doing. That would just cause problems, and it just won't be effective, although people will rally against it. The other thing, governments have to be balanced too, because they don't want to come in too heavy and try and squash something, because that will really drum up a lot of support, because people will support the underdog. So governments have to be smart about what they do, because they could go and try and dampen something or try and stop something and actually create the opposite effect and make something really big, and that would be more powerful than it would have been without too much intervention.
You almost wonder if that's the position of the US Federal Reserve, is don't make too big a deal out of this, or maybe everyone will wake up that this is actually really important as a complete
everybody remembers what
alternative
happened to
Federal
Napster.
Reserve.
They shut down Napster and they said, that's the end of file sharing. It's dead now. No more piracy.
So I think we've with our last 10 minutes, we've explored some sort of longer term issues, the big issues, the broader issues. But I think for our audience here and online or watching this at home, I'd like to hear from each of you. What's your tip to the individual person on the street, the self-made wealthy people here, the self-directed investors, those who are just getting started with investing, those who are just getting their head around this world? What advice would you have? We had people who of course sold out of Bitcoin at $1 because they couldn't believe how much money they'd made. We had people who bought it at 120 and sold out at 1,200 because they couldn't believe how much money they'd made. Doji coins at 0.2 of a cent. I think maybe I'll start with you, Leon Gerard. What are your 2 or 3 top tips for the average Joe?
Well, for the average Joe, or even for someone who aspires to be the average Joe.
Yeah, or the not so average Joe because you're here at the conference or you're
If you're here
watching
at the
this
conference,
conference.
and you may have been
so
self-made,
average.
or maybe you're trying to be self-made again.
Yeah.
It's get in, but be careful. Get in and try to trade, try to learn about some of this financial stewardship, your own sort of IT footprints, what sort of digital sort of echo you have on the internet that people can pick up. So there are some nefarious people out there. That said, use trusted exchanges and be in charge of your own sort of destiny. It's like anyone who's out there, you don't get anywhere without a little bit of self-direction and self-control. So I think this requires a little bit different sort of stewardship. I always recommend a site that at least has two-factor authentication, because you never know when your machine has been compromised. There's very elegant Trojanware out there that can capture your keystroke without you knowing it, and never keep all your Bitcoins in one particular piggy bank. So, you have to spread it around, spread the love, and maybe a paper wallet. So that would be one other thing to investigate. But don't move it all in one transaction and then fail miserably at getting your paper wallet printed or knowing what the keys are. So I think there's some very practical sort of learnings. Everyone who is going to dabble in this industry, it's not plug and play sort of ATM cards out there. It still requires a little bit of self-direction and self-control. And I would really like people to try it. I really think that there will be technologies in the next year or two that will make it much easier and much more secure off the internet and even off your sort of home network to lock it down and to still transact with people easily. And that's really my tips. If you want to promote the industry, get involved with the local community. There's a local Bitcoin meetup here. Learn and bring other people along as well, because the more that you engage the platform, we all are stakeholders in this, so it will increase in value. So that's the other thing.
Dr. Reese Boland.
All right, my three things. First would be remember the basics. Any asset or any currency's price is based on supply and demand, still applies here. The laws of economics haven't lapsed or been suspended. The second would be for those who are in this as traders or entrepreneurs, this isn't a law-free zone. Your customers have rights the same as they do for any other trader. Misleading, deceptive legislation applies, unfair contracts law applies here. This is not a Wild West without any law. And the third would be for anyone who's here as a private individual or an investor, do your homework. Don't go in beyond what you understand. Get some advice if you don't know what you're doing.
Great. Thank
Yeah,
you,
I think
Jeffrey
all this advice is outstanding. But just to reiterate, start small. If you're not in, just begin small. Play with it, get some, spend it, use it a little bit, get a feel for it. No technology is easy. This is edgy, it's out there. And it takes a while to warm up to it. If you're moving into it in a big way, cold storage, paper wallets, use the best, most trusted providers. That's the way forward. I don't recommend Bitcoin as a kind of like your investment opportunity of a lifetime. It may be, but to me, its main merit is a monetary technology and a payment system. I mean, this is important. So it's a bad idea to get into it if you think that this is a path towards riches. Again, it might be, but that seems like a dangerous motivation to get into the markets. Start small, familiarize yourself with it, move in slowly. Always think about security. Two-factor authentication. I hope people understand what Jared meant by that. This is very important. You don't want to be in a system where you don't have two or even three-factor authentication for spending your Bitcoin. So that's the whole of my advice. But also, don't be afraid either. I mean, this sounds scary, right? Don't be afraid. You will not understand Bitcoin until you're an owner. I believe this. You must become an owner, and then you will see.
Right. And I'm wondering if maybe there's an audience member who wants to ask, is this bow tie for sale?
Pardon me?
Is this bow tie for sale?
This one? Oh, yes, sure, I brought plenty. So, I have to think about a price, though. Not 3 Bitcoin. It's probably cheaper than that, actually,
All right, Jamie McIntyre.
Yeah, I guess you decide if you want to invest, whether you invest directly in Bitcoin. I'm bullish on it long term, but obviously it would still be considered a speculative investment. So if you can afford to lose $600, go for it. You got to say the upside, if it went to 10,000, is very high. Downside 600 to zero. If you're happy to be comfortable with that, otherwise you don't invest. Other areas you invest in is you might want to invest in startup companies. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Either be a founder of a startup company or an investor, and one company's already listed on the ASX. I know we're planning to do the same. So there'll be more and more startups, so you can invest in startups as opposed to into Bitcoin itself. But certainly you want to have some Bitcoin on you, otherwise you're just talking about it and not really experiencing it. If you're an entrepreneur and have a business, certainly start accepting Bitcoin. Even if you offer a discount, just get your hands on Bitcoin. If you think Bitcoin's going to be worth more in the future, you're happy to take a discount just to get it. It's another great way to get it. So it's like anything, get yourself educated. It lowers the risk, the more educated you are.
Yeah, great. All right, well, it's been a thoroughly enjoyable discussion, and I trust that you've enjoyed it as much as the panel clearly has.